The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Royal Lodge as Prince Andrew stepped onto his private terrace, coffee cup in hand. The sprawling estate stretched before him like a green carpet, 30 rooms of Georgian grandeur that had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades. He had no idea that this particular Tuesday in November would mark the beginning of the end of his privileged world. The Royal Lodge had always been more than just a home to Andrew. Nestled in the heart of Windsor Great Park, the mansion represented everything he believed he deserved as a member of the House of Windsor. The property, originally built for the royal family in the 1930s, had housed his mother's sister, Princess Margaret, before becoming Andrew's domain in 2003. The lease agreement he had signed seemed ironclad at the time. 75 years for the modest sum of £250 per week, with the understanding that he would invest millions in renovations and maintenance. Andrew had poured his heart and a substantial portion of his wealth into transforming the lodge. The swimming pool gleamed like a sapphire jewel in the carefully landscaped gardens. The tennis court where he had taught his daughters Beatrice and Eugenie to play was pristine. Every room had been restored to perfection, from the grand drawing rooms with their silk wallpapers to the private apartments where he retreated from public scrutiny. This wasn't just a house. It was his legacy, his statement to the world that he remained a prince worthy of such magnificence. But as Andrew sipped his coffee that November morning, storm clouds were already gathering. His association with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein had cast a dark shadow over his reputation. The disastrous BBC Newsnight interview, where he had attempted to explain his friendship with Epstein, had been a public relations catastrophe of epic proportions. Instead of clearing his name, Andrew had appeared defensive, entitled, and completely out of touch with reality. The British public had watched in horror as their prince claimed he couldn't remember meeting his accuser, Virginia Giuffre, despite photographic evidence to the contrary. The interview had unleashed a tsunami of criticism that even the protective walls of Royal Lodge couldn't keep at bay. Corporate sponsors fled from his charitable organizations like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The Pitch at Palace Enterprise program he had founded and championed was effectively dead in the water. Military organizations began quietly distancing themselves from their former patron. The man who had once been known as a war hero for his service in the Falklands War was now seen as a liability to the very institution he represented. Inside the lodge, Andrew's staff moved through their daily routines with increasing unease. The household, once bustling with official engagements and royal duties, had become eerily quiet. Phone calls from Buckingham Palace grew less frequent, and when they did come, the conversations were tense and uncomfortable. Sarah Ferguson, his ex-wife who still lived at the lodge despite their divorce, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but even she could feel the foundation of their comfortable existence beginning to crack. The financial implications of Andrew's scandal became increasingly apparent as the weeks passed. His royal duties had been suspended indefinitely, which meant the substantial income he derived from his position had evaporated overnight. The various business ventures and speaking engagements that had supplemented his income were no longer available. The careful financial ecosystem that had supported his lavish lifestyle at Royal Lodge was collapsing, and the bills for maintaining such an enormous property continued to arrive with mathematical precision. Andrew's predicament was complicated by the very nature of his lease agreement with the Crown Estate. While he paid only £250 per week in rent, he was responsible for all maintenance, repairs, and improvements to the property. The annual costs of maintaining Royal Lodge ran into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. The heating bills alone for a 30-room mansion were astronomical. The grounds required constant attention from a team of gardeners. The security arrangements, while primarily funded by taxpayer money through his police protection, still required significant personal contributions for private security measures. The weight of these financial realities began to press down on Andrew like a physical force. His personal wealth, while substantial by ordinary standards, was nowhere near sufficient to maintain his current lifestyle indefinitely without income. The renovations he had carried out over the years, which had cost millions of pounds, were beginning to look less like wise investments and more like financial millstones around his neck. Meanwhile, in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, discussions about Andrew's future were becoming increasingly urgent. Palace officials who had once spoken of the scandal as a temporary setback were beginning to use terms like permanent damage and irreparable harm to the monarchy's reputation. The Queen, in the final years of her reign, was faced with the heartbreaking prospect of taking decisive action against her son to protect the institution she had served for over 7 decades. The first hint of what was to come arrived in the form of a formal letter from the palace's private secretary. Andrew's military titles and royal patronages were to be returned to the Queen with immediate effect. He would no longer use the style His Royal Highness in any official capacity. The letter was couched in formal language, but its meaning was crystal clear. Prince Andrew was being cast out of the working royal family. As Andrew read the letter in his study at Royal Lodge, surrounded by photographs of himself in military uniform and memories of his years of service to the crown, he must have realized that this was only the beginning. If the palace was willing to strip him of his titles and duties, what else might they be prepared to take away? The comfortable assumption that Royal Lodge would remain his home for life suddenly seemed far less certain. The mansion that had been his pride and joy, his refuge from the storms of public life, was beginning to feel more like a golden prison. Every room held memories of better times, but those memories were now tainted by the knowledge that his world was crumbling around him. The question that haunted his sleepless nights was no longer whether he could weather this particular storm, but whether he could afford to keep the roof over his head while it raged. Outside the lodge's windows, the ancient oak trees of Windsor Great Park stood as silent witnesses to the drama unfolding within. They had watched over the rise and fall of countless royals over the centuries, and now they would observe another chapter in the long and sometimes tragic story of the House of Windsor. The battle for Royal Lodge was about to begin, and Prince Andrew was about to discover just how far the monarchy would go to protect itself from the damage he had caused. The winter of 2022 brought more than just cold winds to Royal Lodge. It brought the harsh reality of financial reckoning that Prince Andrew had been desperately trying to avoid. The civil settlement with Virginia Giuffre had cost him an estimated £12 million, a sum that had drained his liquid assets and left him scrambling to maintain his aristocratic lifestyle. But the money was only part of the problem. The real crisis was the systematic dismantling of everything that had once made Andrew valuable to the House of Windsor. King Charles III, newly crowned and acutely aware of the need to modernize and streamline the monarchy, viewed his brother's situation through the cold lens of institutional survival. The slimmed-down monarchy that Charles had long envisioned had no place for scandal-ridden princes who brought nothing but negative headlines. Every day that Andrew remained at Royal Lodge was another reminder to the British public of the monarchy's failures, another opportunity for Republican sentiment to grow stronger. The pressure on Andrew intensified when Charles began reviewing all Crown Estate properties and their occupants. Royal Lodge, despite Andrew's lease agreement, remained Crown property, and the new king had significant influence over how such properties were managed. Charles had already demonstrated his willingness to make difficult decisions about family members who had become liabilities. The way he had handled the situation with his youngest son Harry and daughter-in-law Meghan showed that blood ties would not protect anyone from the consequences of damaging the royal brand. Sarah Ferguson, still living at Royal Lodge despite their divorce, found herself caught in the crossfire of this royal family feud. Her own position was precarious. She had no official status within the royal family, and her continued residence at the lodge depended entirely on Andrew's hospitality. As rumors began circulating about potential eviction proceedings, Sarah realized that her comfortable lifestyle was under threat as well. The woman who had once been a duchess was now facing the possibility of being homeless, dependent on the charity of friends and whatever income she could generate from her writing and television appearances. The daily routine at Royal Lodge began to reflect the growing uncertainty. Staff members whispered among themselves about whether their positions were secure. The lavish entertaining that had once been a regular feature of life at the estate came to an abrupt halt. The swimming pool, once heated year-round, was allowed to grow cold to save money. The extensive gardens, while still maintained, were scaled back from their former glory. Every expense was scrutinized, every luxury questioned. Andrew's daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, watched with growing concern as their father's world contracted around him. Both young women had established their own lives and careers, but they remained deeply loyal to their father despite the scandals that had engulfed him. They provided emotional support, but their own positions within the royal family made it impossible for them to offer significant financial assistance. Their husbands, while wealthy by normal standards, were not in a position to subsidize the enormous costs of maintaining a royal estate. The legal implications of Andrew's lease agreement became a subject of intense scrutiny by royal lawyers and Crown estate officials. While the 75-year lease seemed to provide Andrew with security, the fine print contained clauses that could potentially be used to terminate the agreement under certain circumstances. If Andrew were found to have brought the crown into disrepute, or if he failed to maintain the property to acceptable standards, grounds for eviction might exist. The legal battle that could ensue would be expensive and public, but Charles's advisors began quietly exploring these options. Media attention on Royal Lodge intensified as journalists and royal watchers recognized the symbolic importance of the property dispute. The mansion became a daily reminder of Andrew's fall from grace, with photographers camping outside the gates to capture any signs of change. The security arrangements, which had always been substantial given Andrew's status, became even more complex and expensive as the threat level increased due to public anger about his past associations. Andrew was expected to stand on his own 2 feet, despite the fact that the scandal that had destroyed his earning potential had also made it impossible for him to pursue normal employment. The catch-22 was cruel but deliberate. Charles wanted Andrew to understand that his continued residence at Royal Lodge was untenable in the long term. Local residents around Windsor began to notice the changes at Royal Lodge. The reduction in staff meant that the property was less well-maintained than it had been in previous years. The security presence, while still substantial, seemed more defensive than protective. The sense of royal grandeur that had always surrounded the estate was gradually being replaced by an atmosphere of embattlement and decline. Andrew's attempts to generate income became increasingly desperate. He explored various business opportunities, but his toxic reputation made it impossible to secure legitimate partnerships. The speaking circuit that had once provided substantial fees was now closed to him. Even charitable organizations were reluctant to be associated with his name, regardless of the cause they represented. The financial noose was tightening with each passing month. The breaking point came when Charles made his first direct move against his brother's residence. Rather than ordering immediate eviction, the king chose a more subtle approach. He cut off the private funding that had been used to supplement Andrew's security arrangements at Royal Lodge. Without this support, the cost of maintaining adequate security became prohibitive. Andrew was faced with the choice of reducing his security to dangerous levels or finding additional funds he simply didn't have. This calculated pressure represented a new phase in the battle for Royal Lodge. Charles was not simply waiting for his brother to leave voluntarily. He was actively creating conditions that would make continued residence impossible. The strategy was designed to avoid the public spectacle of a forced eviction while achieving the same result through financial pressure. As winter deepened around Royal Lodge, Andrew realized that his comfortable assumption of permanent residence was crumbling like the autumn leaves in his once pristine gardens. The mansion that had been his sanctuary was becoming his burden, and the family that had once protected him was now systematically dismantling the foundations of his privileged existence. The battle for his home was entering a new and more dangerous phase, one that would test not just his financial resources, but his very identity as a member of the royal family. Spring 2023 brought no relief to the mounting pressure on Prince Andrew, only a new level of sophistication to the campaign against his continued residence at Royal Lodge. King Charles III had learned valuable lessons from his handling of other family crises, and his approach to the Andrew problem demonstrated a masterclass in royal strategic thinking. Rather than crude ultimatums or public confrontations, Charles employed a series of carefully calculated moves designed to make his brother's position untenable. The first salvo came in the form of a comprehensive review of all security arrangements for non-working royals. The review, ostensibly about cost-cutting and efficiency, specifically targeted the expensive protection provided to Andrew at Royal Lodge. The official rationale was unassailable. Why should taxpayers fund extensive security for a royal who no longer carried out public duties? The practical effect was to shift hundreds of thousands of pounds in annual security costs directly onto Andrew's already strained personal finances. Andrew's attempts to contest the security review revealed just how isolated he had become within the royal establishment. His phone calls to senior courtiers went unanswered. His requests for meetings with Charles were politely declined. Even his mother's former private secretaries, who might once have intervened on his behalf, maintained a careful distance. The institutional machinery of the monarchy that had once protected him had been systematically turned against him. The reduction in security arrangements created a cascade of practical problems at Royal Lodge. Insurance companies, already nervous about covering a property associated with such a controversial figure, threatened to increase premiums or withdraw coverage entirely if security standards fell below acceptable levels. The Crown Estate, as the ultimate owner of the property, expressed concerns about their duty of care to ensure adequate protection for their assets. Andrew found himself caught between impossible choices: pay for security he couldn't afford, or face potential legal action for failing to protect Crown property. Financial investigators working for the Crown Estate began examining Andrew's spending patterns and income sources with forensic precision. Every transaction was scrutinized for evidence of his ability to meet his obligations under the lease agreement. The investigation revealed a troubling picture of a lifestyle maintained through increasingly creative financing arrangements. Andrew had been borrowing against his future income, leveraging his royal status to secure loans that now seemed impossible to repay. The pressure extended beyond Andrew to everyone associated with Royal Lodge. Staff members found their positions increasingly precarious as cost-cutting measures took effect. The housekeeper who had managed the estate for 15 years was given notice. The gardening staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. Even Sarah Ferguson's personal assistant was let go, sending a clear message that the privileged world they had all inhabited was coming to an end. Sarah herself became a particular target of the campaign against Andrew. Palace officials made it clear that her continued residence at Royal Lodge was inappropriate given her complete lack of official status within the royal family. Suggestions were made that suitable alternative accommodation could be found for her elsewhere, away from the toxic atmosphere that surrounded Andrew. These weren't threats, exactly, but the implications were unmistakable. She could leave voluntarily or eventually be forced out along with her ex-husband. Andrew's legal team worked frantically to find loopholes in the lease agreement that might provide some protection, but their research revealed disturbing possibilities for the Crown's lawyers. The lease contained morality clauses that had seemed irrelevant when it was signed but now provided potential grounds for termination. References to bringing the Crown into disrepute took on new significance when viewed in light of Andrew's recent scandals. The 75-year lease that had once seemed like an ironclad guarantee of security now looked more like a document riddled with escape clauses. The psychological toll on Andrew became increasingly apparent to those close to him. The man who had once commanded respect as a naval officer and royal representative now spent his days poring over legal documents and financial statements, searching for solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. His sleep was fitful, his appetite poor, and his famous temper grew shorter with each passing week. The stress of fighting for his home was destroying his health and his relationships with those who still supported him. King Charles, meanwhile, continued his calculated campaign with the patience of a chess master working toward checkmate. He authorized a comprehensive audit of all Crown Estate properties occupied by family members, ostensibly to ensure value for money and appropriate use of royal assets. The audit team that descended on Royal Lodge was thorough and unsympathetic, cataloging every aspect of the property and its maintenance requirements. Their report would provide additional ammunition for any future legal action. The audit revealed maintenance issues that had been overlooked during Andrew's years of comfortable residency. The heating system was aging and inefficient. The roof required substantial repairs. The electrical systems needed updating to meet current safety standards. The total cost of bringing the property up to modern standards was estimated at several £1 million, money that Andrew simply didn't have. The Crown Estate made it clear that these repairs were his responsibility under the terms of the lease. Public opinion, carefully monitored by royal pollsters, showed no sympathy for Andrew's plight. The majority of Britons believed he should lose his home as a consequence of his scandals, and many questioned why taxpayers should continue to subsidize his lifestyle in any way. This public hostility made it politically impossible for Charles to show mercy, even if family loyalty might have inclined him to do so. The monarchy's survival depended on demonstrating that no one was above accountability, not even the king's own brother. International media coverage of the Royal Lodge dispute began to focus on the broader implications for the monarchy's future. Royal correspondents noted that Charles was establishing important precedents about how the institution would handle scandal and misconduct. The message being sent was clear. The days of covering up for problematic family members were over. The new reign would be characterized by transparency, accountability, and consequences for those who damaged the royal brand. Andrew's daughters found themselves in an increasingly difficult position as the pressure on their father intensified. Both Beatrice and Eugenie maintained successful careers and happy marriages, but their father's problems cast a shadow over their own royal duties and public appearances. They faced constant questions about Andrew's situation and growing pressure to distance themselves from him publicly. The choice between family loyalty and their own reputations became increasingly stark. The legal bills associated with defending his position at Royal Lodge continued to mount, adding to Andrew's financial pressures. His lawyers warned him that any court battle with the crown would be enormously expensive and unlikely to succeed. The legal precedents heavily favored the Crown Estate, and public sympathy would be entirely with the monarchy. Fighting eviction through the courts would likely result in complete financial ruin while achieving nothing more than a temporary delay. As spring turned to summer, Andrew realized that his position was becoming untenable. Every strategy he had tried had been countered by Charles's superior resources and political position. The comfortable life he had built at Royal Lodge over 2 decades was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the shell of former grandeur. The battle for his home was entering its final phase, and Andrew was finally beginning to understand that this was a war he could not win. The summer of 2023 marked a turning point in the Royal Lodge saga that few had anticipated. Just as Prince Andrew appeared to be facing inevitable defeat in his battle to keep his home, an unexpected alliance emerged that would transform the entire dynamic of the conflict. The intervention came from an unlikely source, his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson, who had been quietly building her own power base while everyone's attention was focused on Andrew's declining fortunes. Sarah had spent months cultivating relationships with wealthy friends and potential investors who might be willing to support Andrew's continued residence at Royal Lodge. Her approach was sophisticated and strategic, appealing not to sentiment but to self-interest. She positioned the opportunity as a chance to be associated with royal history while potentially profiting from future property values. The Royal Lodge, despite its current controversies, remained one of the most prestigious addresses in Britain, with enormous potential for appreciation and value. The financial package that Sarah assembled was complex but ingenious. A group of wealthy individuals, many of them American entrepreneurs fascinated by British royalty, agreed to establish a trust fund that would cover Andrew's immediate expenses while he worked to resolve his long-term financial problems. The arrangement was structured carefully to avoid any appearance of impropriety while providing Andrew with enough breathing room to resist Charles's pressure campaign. King Charles's reaction to this development revealed just how seriously he viewed the threat to his plans. The emergence of external financial support for Andrew represented a direct challenge to the Crown's authority over royal properties and family members. Palace lawyers immediately began investigating the legal implications of the funding arrangement, searching for grounds to challenge its validity. The prospect of Andrew's indefinite residence at Royal Lodge, subsidized by foreign benefactors, was deeply troubling to the royal establishment. The trust fund arrangement also created uncomfortable questions about the independence of the royal family from outside influences. Critics pointed out that allowing wealthy individuals to essentially purchase influence with a member of the royal family set dangerous precedents. The arrangement raised concerns about potential conflicts of interest and the possibility that Andrew might feel obligated to his benefactors in ways that could compromise his judgment or behavior. Andrew's response to this lifeline was characteristically defiant. Emboldened by the financial support and convinced that he had outmaneuvered his brother, he began speaking more openly about his determination to remain at Royal Lodge. He hired additional legal representation, this time from firms specializing in property law rather than crisis management. The message was clear. He was preparing for a prolonged legal battle rather than seeking a negotiated settlement. The impact on the rest of the royal family was immediate and divisive. Princess, and known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, was reportedly furious that Andrew was using external funding to resist family pressure. Prince Edward, who had maintained strict neutrality throughout the crisis, began expressing concerns about the precedent being set. The unity that Charles had tried to maintain within the family was fracturing under the strain of the prolonged conflict. Sarah Ferguson's role in orchestrating Andrew's financial rescue had unexpected consequences for her own position within royal circles. While she had no official status, her success in mobilizing support for Andrew demonstrated a level of influence and capability that surprised many observers. Some palace insiders began to view her not as a harmless ex-wife living on Andrew's charity, but as a skilled operator who might pose her own challenges to royal authority. The media coverage of the funding arrangement was intensely negative, with journalists and commentators questioning the propriety of foreign benefactors essentially subsidizing a disgraced royal. The optics were particularly damaging given ongoing concerns about transparency and accountability within the monarchy. The public, already skeptical about royal finances, was outraged by the suggestion that wealthy friends could simply step in to protect Andrew from the consequences of his actions. Charles responded to this challenge with characteristic determination and strategic thinking. If Andrew wanted a fight, the king was prepared to escalate the conflict to levels that would make victory Pyrrhic at best. Palace officials began briefing journalists about additional scandals and financial irregularities in Andrew's past that had previously been kept confidential. The gloves were coming off, and the royal family was preparing to destroy one of its own members rather than allow him to defy royal authority. The psychological warfare between the brothers intensified as both sides demonstrated their willingness to inflict maximum damage on each other. Charles authorized the release of private correspondence that showed Andrew's sense of entitlement and disdain for public opinion. Andrew's supporters responded by leaking details about Charles's own questionable financial arrangements during his years as Prince of Wales. The royal family was tearing itself apart in full view of a fascinated and horrified public. The legal battlefield became increasingly complex as both sides marshaled expert witnesses and precedents to support their positions. Andrew's lawyers argued that his lease agreement was legally binding and that the Crown estate had no grounds for termination. Charles's representatives countered that the morality clauses in the lease provided ample justification for eviction, given Andrew's damage to the royal reputation. The case was shaping up to be one of the most significant royal legal battles in modern history. International observers began to question whether the British monarchy could survive such a public display of family dysfunction. Royal correspondents from around the world descended on Windsor to cover the story, creating a media circus that further damaged the institution's reputation. The sight of reporters camped outside Royal Lodge, waiting for developments in the royal family feud, became a powerful symbol of the monarchy's decline in public esteem. Behind the scenes, efforts to find a compromise solution continued despite the public hostility between the brothers. Senior courtiers who had served the royal family for decades worked desperately to identify a face-saving resolution that might allow both sides to claim victory. The proposals ranged from Andrew accepting a smaller property in exchange for leaving Royal Lodge to a complex arrangement that would allow him to remain while accepting significant restrictions on his activities. The financial costs of the conflict were mounting on both sides. Andrew's legal bills were consuming much of his trust fund support, while Charles was spending substantial amounts on his own legal team and public relations efforts. The irony was not lost on observers that both brothers were hemorrhaging money in their fight over a property that neither could truly afford to maintain properly. The battle for Royal Lodge was becoming a war of financial attrition that threatened to bankrupt both combatants. As autumn approached, it became clear that the conflict had reached a stalemate. Andrew had sufficient financial backing to resist immediate eviction, but lacked the resources for a prolonged legal battle. Charles had the legal authority and institutional support to eventually force his brother's departure, but at enormous cost to the monarchy's reputation and family unity. Both brothers faced the uncomfortable realization that their battle might destroy everything they were fighting to protect. The question that haunted observers was no longer whether Andrew would ultimately lose Royal Lodge, but whether the monarchy itself could survive the damage being inflicted by this fraternal war. The institution that had weathered world wars, abdications, and divorces was now facing its greatest challenge from within, a family so divided that it seemed willing to destroy itself rather than find a path to reconciliation. The final chapter of the Royal Lodge battle began not with legal papers or public statements, but with a private family tragedy that forced both brothers to confront the true cost of their destructive conflict. In late 2023, Princess Beatrice was hospitalized following a stress-related collapse that doctors attributed to the overwhelming pressure she faced trying to maintain relationships with both her father and her uncle. The sight of his daughter in a hospital bed, caught between family loyalties that threatened to tear her apart, finally penetrated Andrew's defenses in a way that legal threats and financial pressure had failed to achieve. King Charles's visit to the hospital marked the first face-to-face meeting between the brothers since their conflict had escalated beyond the point of polite royal disagreement. The conversation that took place in Beatrice's room was witnessed only by immediate family, but its consequences would reshape the entire Royal Lodge dispute. Charles, confronted with the human cost of his campaign against Andrew, was forced to acknowledge that institutional interests could not always override family bonds. Andrew, seeing his daughter's suffering as the direct result of his stubborn refusal to accept reality, finally began to understand that his battle for Royal Lodge was hurting the people he claimed to love most. The negotiations that followed were conducted in absolute secrecy, with only the most senior royal advisors aware of the discussions taking place. The challenge was to find a solution that would allow both brothers to save face while addressing the fundamental issues that had created the conflict. Andrew needed to find a way to leave Royal Lodge without appearing to have been defeated, while Charles required assurance that his authority as king would not be undermined by appearing to reward defiant behavior. The breakthrough came when Sarah Ferguson proposed a solution that had been overlooked by everyone else involved in the dispute. Rather than focusing on who would control Royal Lodge, she suggested treating the property as a historical asset that could benefit the entire royal family while removing it as a source of personal conflict. Her proposal involved converting Royal Lodge into a private royal residence that would be available to all family members for specific purposes, while removing it from the realm of permanent individual occupancy. Under Sarah's proposed arrangement, Andrew would not be evicted from Royal Lodge, but would instead become its custodian on behalf of the royal family. The property would be renovated and maintained using funds from the royal estate, relieving Andrew of the crushing financial burden that had made his position untenable. In exchange, Andrew would accept restrictions on his use of the property and would agree to make it available for other royal family members when needed for official purposes. The legal framework for this arrangement required months of careful negotiation to establish. Andrew would retain his lease agreement, but under modified terms that gave the Crown Estate greater oversight of the property's use and maintenance. The funding arrangement with his wealthy benefactors would be restructured to focus on the property's historical preservation rather than Andrew's personal support. Most importantly, Andrew would accept a formal role as property custodian that would come with specific duties and accountability measures. Charles's acceptance of this compromise reflected his growing understanding that completely destroying his brother might ultimately damage the monarchy more than finding a way to contain the threat he represented. The king's advisors had warned that forcing Andrew into complete destitution could create a dangerous precedent for how the royal family treated members who fell from grace. International observers were already questioning whether the British monarchy had become too ruthless in its pursuit of institutional survival. The implementation of the compromise required Andrew to make significant personal concessions that effectively ended his lifestyle of royal privilege. He agreed to a substantial reduction in his living space within Royal Lodge, occupying only a portion of the mansion while the rest was maintained for potential use by other family members. His entertainment and travel budgets were slashed to levels that reflected his new status as a non-working royal with limited income. Most significantly, he accepted ongoing supervision of his activities by palace officials to ensure compliance with the new arrangement. Sarah Ferguson's role in the resolution enhanced her position within the royal family for the first time since her divorce from Andrew. Her diplomatic skills and practical problem-solving abilities had succeeded where lawyers and courtiers had failed. Charles quietly authorized the restoration of some of her privileges, including security protection and a formal role in the custodianship of Royal Lodge. The woman who had been written off as a peripheral figure had engineered the most significant royal compromise in decades. The public announcement of the resolution was carefully crafted to present the outcome as a victory for royal unity and historical preservation. Andrew was portrayed as selflessly accepting a new role in service to the royal family's heritage, while Charles was praised for his wisdom in finding a solution that balanced accountability with compassion. The media coverage was generally positive, with commentators noting that the royal family had demonstrated an ability to resolve even the most difficult internal conflicts. Behind the scenes, the reality was more complex. Andrew's acceptance of the compromise was grudging and conditional, driven more by exhaustion and family pressure than genuine reconciliation with his brother. Charles remained suspicious of Andrew's long-term compliance with the agreement and insisted on regular review meetings to monitor the situation. The trust between the brothers had been severely damaged by their conflict, and rebuilding their relationship would require years of careful effort. The impact on Andrew's daily life at Royal Lodge was dramatic and immediate. The staff reductions meant that he was responsible for many tasks he had never performed for himself. The financial constraints forced him to abandon many of the luxury services he had taken for granted. The oversight from palace officials meant that his privacy was significantly reduced with regular inspections and reports on his activities. The man who had once lived like a king was now essentially a highly privileged caretaker of his own former palace. The broader implications of the Royal Lodge resolution extended far beyond the immediate family dispute. The compromise established new precedents for how the monarchy would handle future scandals involving family members. The balance between accountability and compassion that had been achieved would influence decisions about other problematic royals for generations to come. The institutional changes implemented during the crisis would reshape the royal family's approach to property management, financial oversight, and family governance. As 2024 dawned, Royal Lodge stood as a symbol of both conflict and resolution within the House of Windsor. The magnificent mansion that had nearly torn the royal family apart had instead become a testament to their ability to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Andrew remained in his home, but under circumstances that bore little resemblance to his former comfortable existence. Charles had asserted his authority as king while avoiding the complete destruction of his brother. The battle for Royal Lodge was over, but its consequences would echo through the monarchy for years to come. The story of Royal Lodge serves as a powerful reminder that even the most privileged families are not immune to the destructive power of pride, stubbornness, and conflicting loyalties. The British royal family's ability to survive this particular crisis while learning important lessons about accountability and compromise may well determine their capacity to remain relevant and respected in the modern world. The mansion in Windsor Great Park stands today not just as a royal residence, but as a monument to the painful process of institutional evolution in the face of personal failure and family dysfunction.